Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 14 September. It will be sunny in the morning and cloudy in the afternoon, with highs of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:24 a.m. and sunset at 7:10 p.m. We are on the 45th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and we will be hearing more about the Soviets, won't we?
Yes, you're right, Philippe. That's what we're going to be hearing a lot more about is the Soviets, especially over the next coming days. But I'll leave that for Roger to tell us a little bit more about what's happening there. But otherwise, for me, more or less, it's the same on the ground. The German Luftwaffe are constantly bombing the Mokotów district, yet the insurgents are still holding the district. We're on, the 45th day of the uprising, so they're holding pretty strong in that district, while other districts are falling. They also bomb the University of Technology, where a few people end up losing their lives. There's a hospital there, and that hospital stays more or less in that area up until the end of the uprising, and then it's evacuated outside of Warsaw. The Midtown district, again, the Luftwaffe are bombing constantly the Midtown and Cherniaków district, as well as bombs, as well as artillery, and it is becoming quite difficult. A lot of insurgents, a lot of civilians are now living in the basement like they did in the Old Town. So pretty much everything that was happening in the Old Town is now repeating itself all along the rest of Warsaw. So, for example, hospitals are moving down floor by floor by floor till they end up in the basements. Antoni Hruszczal has a situation report, and I quote, "We're suffering great bloody losses. We will fire our last cartridges. We've not eaten bread for several days. We are starving. The breaking of promises is breaking the spirit of the soldiers and the people." The information received by the BBC that Warsaw had received 100 tons of weapons and ammunition since the 1st of August up until the 12th of September. For accuracy and according to the facts, they want to state that Warsaw has received less than 30 tons, for example, 170 containers. They do acknowledge 47 drops, after which counting 47 drops gives them 92 tons. The difference between acknowledging drops and receiving drops are two completely different things, because sometimes instead of 12 containers reaching the insurgents, they would receive 1 to 2 containers from one drop. So some of these drops are not even landing into insurgent hands, they're landing into the enemy hands, which gives the enemy an advantage. It's been noted that during capitulation, sometimes the insurgents noticed that the German soldiers were holding weapons that were dropped in by the Allies, which brought their morale down even lower. So, right, moving on. Roger, you've been our man on the ground talking about the Soviets, and a lot is happening today with the Soviet army, isn't it? Especially when it comes down to the West Bank of Warsaw. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, the Soviets are clearing the last pockets of resistance on the eastern side of the Vistula, so clearing Praga. There are sort of ongoing battles for things like the barracks there, for the area of the zoo, and that's the sort of it's a mopping up operation effectively. And interestingly, they've brought in now the elements of what's known to history as the Berling army, not Berlin but Berling, after its commander, Zygmunt Berling, which was, as we mentioned before, is a group of or a large grouping made up predominantly of those Poles deported to the Soviet Union during that comparatively brief and rather bloody period of Soviet occupation of eastern Poland between 1939 and 41. So, as we know, many hundreds of thousands of Poles were deported. A lot of them, so it's about, I think from memory, 115,000 get out with the Anders Army, which comes out via Palestine in 1942. They make their way west, landing in Persia, then via Palestine, and end up fighting in the Italian campaign alongside the British and others. Those that sort of missed the boat, as it were, and didn't get out with Anders were sort of lumped in with the Berling Army and had to fight alongside the Soviets. So you've really got Poles fighting on all flanks of this conflict in Europe. And the Berling Army was thrown in. Obviously, there's huge symbolic significance to Polish troops under Soviet command fighting for Warsaw, the Polish capital. So they're thrown into these battles in Prague, and as you'll see, days that follow, they're thrown in again in a much more dramatic way in the days that will follow. On this particular day, the Kościuszko Division, which was the sort of proper name for that unit, lost 1,792 soldiers. That's both killed, wounded, and missing in the efforts to capture Praga. So, as you can see, I mean, that gives you a bit of an insight into the ferocity of the fighting there. But obviously, it's a tragedy if you're one of those 1,792 soldiers that were lost in the fighting for Praga. But it really pales into insignificance when you consider the sort of death toll that's been raging in the fighting and the massacres, as we've said before, on the west side of the river. So it rather puts the sort of fighting in the east into some degree of perspective, I think. So that's the Soviet activity on the ground in Praga, but they're also very active in the air on this day, Claire. What's going on there?
The Soviets are active in the air, and actually also are the Western Allies. So on September the 13th to the 14th, we have airdrops in considerable quantities, both from the Soviets and the Western Allies. According to a note from the Soviet 6th Air Army headquarters, Soviet planes dropped 30 tons of food that day, along with 1,200 grenades and 68,000 weapons to Warsaw. What we don't know is how effectively they were packed, how they were dropped, where they were picked up, and how useful the Polish insurgents found them. Nevertheless, there are supplies being dropped in. And also, very significantly, the Soviets have now, we know, given permission for the Western Allies to come over in their supply planes and actually to land and refuel on Soviet-held airfields, which is hugely significant. It virtually doubles the amount of material these planes can bring in because they no longer have to bring in these large fuel containers. So the West are coming in. It's not always very successful. We know that on this day, at least one Liberator aircraft tried to turn back because it had some technical failure. So it was on its way back to base when that was shot down over Hungary and the entire crew died. But that was just one out of a total of 85 Allied airplanes from all sides that took 282 flights. And again, I mean, London that gives a slightly different perspective. The Soviets are recording how many tons of food they had dropped, the numbers of supplies and equipment. But the British are writing a rather more nuanced report. So they say on this day, it's a report from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the Soviets began airdrop weapons, ammunition and food over Warsaw, although in scant amounts, they say. They also dropped Russian weapons and ammunition, not as requested by Home Army Command, captured weapons, which they'd have found easier to use, would have fitted with their ammunition supplies and so on. So again, it seems to be this sort of continuing delivery of Soviet supplies, but rather cynically done. The British report goes on, these drops were made without parachutes, so their effective value was problematic. However, Soviet aid was effective in providing air cover against German air bombardments. So there is this very important sense of the skies above Warsaw are now finally being really contested, and that is having some impact. What we need now is not just those flights coming in from the east and the limited amounts of flights coming in from the Western Allies. What the Poles really need is significant quantity of supplies brought in essentially by the American Air Force.
Thank you so much for listening to Day 45. It's been a bit of a short one today, but we will come back with Day 46 tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget, if you like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. Thanks so much, everyone.